Radicalization, a Winnipeg-based initiative dedicated to combating violent extremism in Manitoba. We create awareness on how extremist organizations target, exploit, and recruit individuals in the cause to perpetuate or perpetrate violence in society. I'm Caden Lee, the director of Realize Radicalization. I'm joined by my fellow members and co-founders, Luke Fontaine Richardson, Ethan Margolis, Orko Ahmed, and Vaughn Jamora. So today we're speaking with Dougald Lamont. Dougald is a leader of the Manitoba Liberal Party and member of the Manitoba Legislative Assembly for St.Boniface. This is our third encounter with Dougald. We previously met him at his office, and he attended one of our presentations on radicalization last winter, and he has been a gracious supporter since meeting us. But Dougald also really provides interesting insight and perspectives on a lot of topics that relate to radicalization. Every conversation we've had with him so far has been very interesting, and we've walked away very impressed with his broad knowledge that he possesses in so many areas of topics. So today we're going to be asking Dougald some questions regarding political polarization, disinformation, radicalization, and how COVID-19 sort of interacts with these areas. We want to hear his perspective because as a public figure and legislator, he has the ability to bring more awareness to and attempt to combat these issues through his role in government. So we'll get into it. First of all, Dougald, I want to thank you for coming.
Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure.
So we'll start here. So as a politician, how do you feel about the current state of political polarization in society? Is it something you find alarming, or is this a trend that will come to pass?
Yeah, no, it's very alarming. I sometimes think about, like, I'm 50 years old, and growing up in the 70s, there was all sorts of stuff, like when you were a kid, but you still, there was the Vietnam War, and there were protests, and in the 1980s, there were the Cold War was going on, and you had all sorts of divisions, but I've never seen it quite like this. And I think there are lots of people who are talking about it, and it's a whole mix of stuff. As you know, like, we were already heading towards worse and worse polarization, and like it was already happening. It's already been happening for a while. There was it was something a friend of mine said actually on Facebook. He said is that the way he expressed it is that the margins are sort of dominating the debate. So what happens is that that sort of reasonable and centrist ideas are sort of disappearing because you have this push to either side, because the system, I think it is a response to failing systems, right? So if people aren't able to, if all of a sudden they have a sudden drop in their standard of living, right, they'll sort of say, well, who's to blame for this? And they might take some blame on themselves, but they often will not blame people they're politically allied to. So they'll say, well, who are the bad people who are making my life worse? And there's a lot of energy in that. It's easier for people to divide than it is for people to unite, to bring people together. But one of the things about how this plays out, ultimately you do actually have to make life better for people. And recognizing that, that there are people, you still have to recognize that people are human beings, right? Even the people who are being sort of awful, that sometimes the expressions of people's frustration or sometimes even hatred is because they've been suffering for one reason or another. There's some people, and then there are people in positions of power who will then manipulate that. Like, that's kind of the way I think about it. The one thing, because the stuff you've told me is so interesting, and it has been sort of, you get movements that sort of bubble up, and then you actually have mainstream places or parties and politicians who try to capitalize on that, right? So they'll say, oh, look, there's a whole bunch of angry people there. They're kind of organized. What can we do to bring them on board? Which means sometimes pandering to them, which is dangerous. Rather than and inflaming. So, well, what do we have to do to encourage the it could be a conspiracy theory or the nasty thing that these people are saying and believing, rather than saying, well, what do we actually have to do to address their issues or problems? So as the question of how we get out of it is, it has to be a mix of politics but actual action, right? You actually have to do things to change people's lives, and not just do lip service. So I mean, I have my own views about how that should be done, but part of it is to really recognize, like I entered politics because I thought, well, for 40 years, things have been getting worse gradually and gradually for too many people. And, so that means that lots of people, they really have, relatively speaking, it's harder and harder to pay medical bills, pay for a house. You graduate from a job and you hope that things will go well. And it's been incredibly hard. There have been a bunch of crises. So people have to take that seriously. And I think to recognize, to me, the major way to change people's lives is their ability to earn a living and support themselves. But so it's a sort of thing, to me, it's the absolute core of everything, because one of the things I realized after meeting with you guys a couple of times, I stumbled across a paper. I think I meant to send it to you, but it showed that after certain kinds of economic crises, like it's called a financial crisis. It's different than just a dip, when there's a bit of bad business and a few businesses, unemployment goes up a little bit. But when you have a really serious crisis and banks stop working and tons of people lose their homes and become unemployed, which happened in 2008, in 140 different countries across hundreds of years of history, you saw a divergence. It split. And people either became more nationalist, which meant they cared about, they said, okay, we're going to become nationalist. We're going to just look after ourselves. We don't want to deal with people who are outside. Or they became more socialist. That was 140 different countries. And in one of those, and sometimes they become national socialists, right? So you become Nazis. And to me, part of this is that, my theory is just that when the money system, one of the things that money does is that it helps us deal with each other in a way that's peaceful, right? It's not always fun, and sometimes you get screwed on a deal, but at least you're able to say, okay, well, we're going to take this money, or I'll give you this, or do this for service or whatever. When money stops working, people lose that way of interacting. And it means that your only other options. So how do you get people to do what you want? You threaten them, or you take their stuff. And that's part of where you start. That's where you start to get to the violence in the street and people being miserable. And so I think we are in a dangerous situation. I'm an optimist, so I always think there's ways out. But it also, you have to have this thing of actually doing something to fix people's lives, and not patting them on the head and just saying you have to have a better attitude, because that's not going to work.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting you bring that up about that divergence, because it seems like there's a massive divergence right now in society due to COVID-19. And a lot of that's being driven by these economic interests, right? You have people saying, and I would say they have legitimate economic grievances too, because if they're not getting the proper support, then how can they live? But it's kind of creating this air of such distrust of government and distrust of health officials. And it's it's polarizing, but it's also really alarming. And so how do we attempt to mitigate that and show people, listen, this is the truth. This is a global pandemic. We do have to take this seriously. This isn't a hoax. Yeah. And, you need to listen to your officials.
Well, one of the things we said, and there was another article I was going to share with you, but it was written in March, and somebody said, so this was about a week after we declared the pandemic in Manitoba, and somebody said, we're bound to have protests and riots, because there always have been throughout history in pandemics, which I didn't know. And so because it's hard, right? Is the things that you're asking people to do to keep each other safe. If the government isn't willing to step in and make sure that people can earn a living or not go bankrupt, the pressures on people are going to be massive. They're intense, and I think that's part of it. Is that so the ways to get out, in terms of building trust, what we suggested back in March was for the government to say, let's have a team of people from all parties, so that it isn't just a question of, well, it's this one party that's to blame. So that when it comes, and we said there are going to be some issues for public, this needs to just be for the public health stuff. For the public, because there's political stuff we're going to disagree on, but there should be stuff we can all agree on together. And if we're all on one page, then it means that nobody can say well, this is just the PCs doing this or the Liberals or the NDP. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen federally either. But that's one of the things you have to do. The hard part is that even going into this, there were people who had a distrust of government and a distrust of healthcare for all sorts of reasons, because it's sort of become very professionalized in a sense, or very clinical, right? People don't have that. They don't have that sense of a relationship of trust, like, and so you end up getting a downward spiral where this all breaks down, where people don't trust their politicians, they don't trust their government, and that's a hard thing to, when that's lost, it's hard to recover. The other thing, of course, we have government, we have opposition politicians who are, well, like, I'm an opposition politician too, and so you have to also be critical, where you think the government is being dangerous or making mistakes. But so much of what is politics now is that it's far, far more divisive. So basically, there are a few things that you can use that really motivate people in very negative ways, and one is disgust. So when you look at the conspiracy theories that have been attached to masks and all sorts of other stuff, you also get accusations of child abuse and all sorts of other, like, really serious crimes that are stomach churning often, right? And the other, and there's a great TED talk about the politics of disgust, because it's a way of motivating people. Disgust is the easiest emotion to trigger in people, right? Like, I could tell you some gross story and you'll all feel sick, right? About, like, if I won't, but it's incredibly easy to evoke disgust. So you'll hear when you have rhetoric where people talk about people being vermin or people committing horrific crimes, these are feelings that evoke disgust in people. And the thing that people have found is that disgust tends to make people more politically conservative. So it actually shuts down your openness to other people, right? And this is part of what drives fear in a pandemic. Like, human beings have always lived with illness. We've always lived with the risk of plague and people getting sick. And we've kind of forgotten that because vaccines and modern medicine have been so effective. So as someone who's, I've been not a historian, but a student of history, when I look back, it's amazing to me the sort of forces you see being unleashed one way or another. And some of it is the strong waves of emotion as people are strongly opposing government initiatives, or it's. But the other thing is that it has become a political football. So in the U.S. right now, it is the U.S. sort of ended up becoming a public health hazard for the whole world, just because, in two ways. One is that the measures they took failed to contain COVID, but the other is that because it's a presidential election year, everything became politicized. So whether you believe in COVID, whether it's how serious it is, whether to wear a mask or not, all these things have become deeply, deeply politicized, so that you're at this point where even if you're trying to say something true and warn somebody, like I said, this, when you have really serious partisanship, there are times when I stand up and I say something, and I'm not saying it to be political or to get attention or to grandstand. I'm actually trying to tell my opponents, the PCs, look, you're heading for a bridge. It's like, I feel like I'm standing on the road with flares and saying, look, the bridge down the way is out. You're about to drive the entire bus over a cliff. Slow down and stop. And people just go, oh, well, you're just saying that because you're a liberal. And that's kind of where we're at with a bunch of stuff in the States as well, where people are saying, please wear a mask, wash your hands, stay indoors, follow these public health measures. And people are saying, well, you're just saying that because you don't want Trump to win. And it's really unfortunate and dangerous, just because we're not able to find that common ground on measures that will make a difference between whether people live or die. And that, it's been like one of the funnier things is that people have sort of said, well, if you ever watched a horror movie and said, well, why would anyone do that, or why would you back into a dangerous room when there's a serial killer around, or why would you? There's no way Jurassic Park would reopen again after all the terrible things that happened. And you go, okay, no, you know what? All that stuff would happen because people are just not. They don't take the risk seriously often until it happens to them, and that's been the challenge, is that you're trying to communicate something, how serious something is, and if it works, like if you actually succeed in avoiding it, and preventing something bad from happening, people still don't take it seriously because they don't see what you've prevented.
Yeah, absolutely. It would seem to, well, I mean, everyone knows this, but like this polarization is being primarily driven by social media, right? So I think the reason you're seeing everything become so politicized is that we've never had a platform like this in our lifetime. Well, this is the first time in our lifetime. Like I remember in 2008, it felt like cooperation was just so different between the Republicans and the Democrats, and now it's just gotten so out of hand. And if you look at what your random family member might be posting on Facebook regarding COVID, and it's being shared by 5 million people, and then you go on Twitter and then you look at what people are posting about Republicans, it's so out of hand. And I remember when we were talking to you last time, you were kind of interested in bringing up this fact of how social media truly is driving this polarization.
Yeah.
And I want to get more of your perspective on that.
Well, and so some of it is that it is a deliberate. There was another story recently about Facebook, and some of it's just an accident, right? So it's this idea that, or you have algorithms that are set up to feed you certain kinds of information and to keep you engaged and to keep you on the site as much as possible. So what they found is that it was actually, whether it was intentional or not, that they were essentially, algorithms were feeding up more and more radical ideas to people as a way of feeding, and which would eventually drive them towards certain points of view. And I do still try to engage with people who disagree with me. I had a guy who was always saying, he kept messaging me and saying, I'm sure you won't ever dare to answer this, and so we would have this back and forth. But it's clear to me that he's still stuck in, he keeps retreating into the conspiracy theories, like, that COVID is not real, or that it was created on purpose. And part of it is just about the way human brains work. We like stories, and we like stories that are neat and tidy. And the world is not neat and tidy, and the world doesn't follow happy stories with closure. It's often big and messy. The truth and reality of history, and the way life really works is not this nice little tale, where everything works out in the end. Sometimes it doesn't, but that is so strong and appealing to us, that people can't. It's almost like they can't handle the anxiety that comes with not being in control. Right? People are. It's if you say, well, why would anyone ever believe that that this virus was created, when we've had viruses and diseases that people have had for thousands, millions of years, that were not created in a lab. And it's partly because for people who are conspiracy theorists, there's comfort there in thinking someone is in control, even if it's someone they don't like, or that somebody is actually calling the shots, that this is all organized, because then you might be able to solve it. The hardest part about it is accepting that, no, these are things that we do have control about it, but it's not because but the control is actually with us, for our ability, if we wear masks, if we do the right things. But it ends up being this sort of very superstitious and desperate way of looking at the world, but the hardest part about it is that when people come up with an idea or a theory that's sort of, they've set it up in such a way that you cannot possibly get through them, right? That's the hardest part. And actually, that's probably exactly what you talked about when you get into the echo chamber, like when you guys talked about someone who's gotten to the point of radicalization is that whatever you say to them will just be seen as an attempt at manipulating them. Like, they basically, because they've stopped treating you as a human being, it means that that anything you try to say to them is not is is seen as a manipulation. It's not seen as sincere. Like when I say to somebody, like the reason I want you to, I don't actually want you to wear a mask because it's a drag. I want you to wear a mask so you don't die. And I had that conversation with somebody online. He said, "Well, you're just pretending to care." I was like, "No, I actually don't want you to die, and I don't want you to get sick and kill me either." Right? But people have retreated to that point of mistrust that. And it's because they're it's like they're holding on so tight to the idea that they can't let go of it.
Just wanted to touch. I think what a lot of this is coming back to is the internet. I think we've mentioned that. You've mentioned just how much distrust has been, I guess, sown by the internet and by social media conglomerates. But I want to ask, do you think, in any way, not saying any specific government, but do you think the provincial government has any role to play in regulating the internet to prevent radicalization? Or do you think these kind of oversights will just marginalize groups even further?
I do think that what needs to be done, I do think that there is room for it. We were trying to come up with a bill that would stop the provincial government from advertising on platforms that have hate, right? So, but I think there's two problems. One is that is that we have what you call reliable information, right? The stuff that's produced, it's vetted. An actual person who at a newspaper, for example, that reporter has a name, they have a job. If that newspaper gets sued, specific people will be held to account, right? So publishers, they're all wary. They put more effort into fact checking, right? Because they're all real people and they're accountable. It's like, to me, what has caused the crisis with Facebook and social media, it is partly greed, it is partly algorithms, but what it is fundamentally is that Facebook is not accountable for anything it puts online, and neither is YouTube, and neither is Google. And that is a specific law in the Millennium Copyright Act that says, it actually makes Facebook possible. It says that Facebook and Google and YouTube are not responsible for what is on their platform. That's somebody else's business. You can post whatever you want, and then someone complains and they'll take it down later. Well, that's not good enough, because for two reasons. One is the question that nobody in Silicon Valley ever seems to ask is, how can this be turned into a weapon? How can this be weaponized? So what's happened is that Facebook, YouTube, and Google, and they are absolutely massive, and they are people, when they think about hate online and radicalization, there are small groups, but like the YouTube comments, YouTube groups, the people are being radicalized by content on the biggest companies in the world. It's not just little ones. So one of the things that there has to be accountability is to say, look, Facebook and Google, if you publish this stuff, you're actually going to be held to account. But the other is that you shouldn't be allowing people who are completely anonymous to hide behind these things. So, because the two things about it is you have anonymous groups, and people think of them as being free floating. Well, you've got this group of white supremacists here, you've got this group of fundamentalist radicals here. These groups get money, but they're also in politics, and it's not a new thing in politics. You get AstroTurf groups or third parties, where political parties, especially in the US, have a long tradition of setting up phony groups that are where they have plausible deniability, or running phony candidates, paying people from other parties. Like Kanye West right now running for president is not a new thing. Is that Roger Stone and Donald Trump together used to, on going back 40 more years and more, would get African American candidates to run in contests in order to split the vote for the left. It's not a new thing. And the same thing happens with these sort of third-party organizations, which are really actually working for or with another party. In the US, it's particularly bad because there's unbelievable amounts of money flowing into it. But similar things happen in Canada as well. So you've got, and part of it is, but it's a weird offshoot of, with political parties, we're not allowed to take money from unions or corporations in Canada anymore. So you're only allowed to take money from individuals, which in principle is a great idea. The hard part about it is that we haven't replaced it. So political parties have lost lots of funding. It's harder for them to do their work, and governments won't fund them with public money, even though I think they should. So what happens is that both corporations and unions pour money into third-party groups, which then act to support one party or another, or multiple parties, and occasionally you'll also have complete rogue groups, and that's what happened in the 2016 U.S. election. It's happened, and it's happened in Canada as well, where you have people being paid to suppress the vote. People are, they're running ads and running messages that, because they can't be tied to a political party, that the political party can wash their hands and say, well, we didn't say that terrible thing, right? And instead you have but it makes things much more divisive and much more poisonous, because there are no rules governing. There's no ref, so you have no rules governing what normally would happen. And I'd say the one other thing about social media is just how it's just the entire idea of privacy has almost completely disappeared. So any part of your past personal life is considered fair game, and in ways that it would never once have been that would never have been acceptable, and it's extremely destructive. So my attitude, I don't know that or I've been trying to figure out how to get out of it, and I think part of it is when I first was elected, and when I first started my campaigns, I would tell my team, we need to try to be a bit more forgiving, and that's like, I actually think that it's one of the most underrated things you could talk about. But the idea that what I see as the division is escalating punishment, right? So you say, well, this side does this, and it's just this the division and the polarization is a result of people hurting each other more and more and escalating more and more and more. So how do you de-escalate, and how do you unwind that? And part of that is to say, well, there are other ways of making these things better than punishing people, or hurting people, or calling for someone's head. That there should be room to allow someone to apologize and make amends, right? And that's another way of making things better, rather than just saying, well, how are we going to punish them as harshly as possible? But that's where we're going, right? With both the left and the right, it's become, or it's very punitive and very harsh, and people stop caring about each other. So the only way out ultimately that's how peace treaties work, right? You actually need to be able to talk to people, recognize people as a human being, and there I haven't figured it out entirely, but that idea of forgiveness is a way of healing the divisions and the fighting that's happened.
So would an example of this kind of be like, I think California has experimented with a law where you can have the right to be deleted from social media, and like you can choose to have your past content deleted. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think it started in France. It was like the right to be forgotten. But part of it is just that individuals should have some control over their own information. And if you've read the book by Christopher Wiley, Mind F, about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, it's truly shocking. The amount of information that's collected on people, and basically they paid people through Amazon's Mechanical Turk, download this app, and when the app came down, it downloaded all their information, and then it would go and download all the information from their friends too. So it absolutely exploded, but it meant that people were collecting, is that Cambridge Analytica had unbelievable files, and Christopher Wiley said, the thing he said was that Facebook knows more about you than your spouse probably does, about your interests and what you want to do. And there are two things about that. One is it exposes you to manipulation, and means that people will know exactly what your buttons are in order to push them and make you angry or sad or stop you from voting. But the other is that you should have a right, is that what's happened is that you have become the product. It was actually true of newspapers as well. So when newspapers newspapers they don't sell news. They would sell the reader to the advertiser. And that's exactly what Facebook and Google and YouTube do as well. But it's your information and who you are that has become valuable, and it's traded and sold, and people don't have control over their own information. And that would be a huge step. The other step would be to treat Facebook, YouTube, and Google as publishers, and to say they are accountable for what they publish, to make them pay and have them pay, and not just taxes, but to pay people for the information they're using, in like copyright fees or royalties, because that would actually help. Sorry, and one of the things that would solve the revenue problem that lots of journalism outlets are facing. But what's happening right now is that you have, if it's so-called quality information that's accountable, that somebody who has an actual physical address has written about a politician or about whatever, that the only way they can make that pay for it, or they can make that they can afford to pay for that, is putting it behind a paywall. So we have a situation where, or you get 5 or 10 free articles a month. Then other than that, those articles are actually restricted from circulating on the internet. So articles that are more likely to be fact-checked and true are less likely to circulate because they're stuck behind a paywall. But the stuff that does circulate is the stuff that has no limits on it, but also has no accountability. So it's much easier. It is actually literally much easier to share a meme than it is to share that's completely filled with false information than it is to share an article that's factual. And that is actually baked into the way those systems work. So part of it is you actually have to address the fact that, and find a way of making it just as easy for accountable information. It isn't necessarily 100% true, but at least it's accountable. Like, for that information to circulate as easily as junk, because what's happened is the internet, as it has been built, makes it much easier for misinformation and disinformation to be circulated than because it's cheap, because lies are cheap and easy, than it is for facts to circulate, because facts cost more money to check.
Yeah, 100%, and that kind of goes off of the kind of perverse economic incentive that these companies are allowed to go towards, because they're just completely consumed with driving profit and also having more people use their platforms.
Yeah.
So
and it's engagement and rage, like the things that actually make people. I think one of the things that happens with people who are sharing junk information is that I think they feel like they're a town crier, is that they see a risk and they think they're helping their community by sharing that risk. But if that risk isn't real, so they feel. I think it is empowering for people to be saying, look out for this group, look out for this, what's happening here. But what they're saying isn't true, and it has real and dangerous consequences in the real world. So you say, for politicians as well, but if you're saying, well, look, the reason I don't have a job is because of immigrants, or the reason I don't have a job is because of Muslims, which both of those are routinely made all the time by far right. Those claims are far right, and not by conservative governments, I will say, and their bad policies. Then it's much easier to do that. But I think people think they're sort of defending their community against outsiders and risks, right? So think about it. So you can see why that somebody would think, oh, why are my uncle and my aunt sharing these horrible things on Twitter? It's, well, they're trying to warn us all about something bad that's happening, when that bad thing isn't happening at all, right? Like, well, but the things, they become more and more entrenched into. But these are absolutely deliberate, psychological manipulation tools that have been weaponized by political parties and political movements in order to be able to get people to vote a certain way, or get people not to vote at all. And those are the two things. Like, there's when people think of elections, most of the time they think, well, what do you have to do to get people to vote for you? But the reality is that for a long time, if you have the data that you have in Facebook, and this was on Channel 4 last night, but it's happened in Canada. So you have, here's the people I want to get out to vote. Here are my opponent's supporters. So people go, what's the ad I have to do make sure my people get out to vote? What ad do I have to say that will suppress the vote? and it is effective. Like it was the number they were actually able to track down people individually. So they found their name on a list from the Trump voter campaign, find their address in Milwaukee, and ask them whether they voted or not, and they didn't. And they had been targeted for suppression. It was called, but and this is part. This has been part of politics for a long time, but it's a thing that it's sort of been behind closed doors but it's incredibly important for people to understand and know about because I actually don't think the mainstream media and reporters understand it that much. Like they focus on opinion polls and they focus on gaffes and they focus on what somebody said, but the actual machinery of manipulating public opinion that happens behind the scenes is massive. It's got tons of money into it, and it's also very secretive. So, like I remember being after 2016, there were fake news stories and fake newspapers that were set up. So part of it is it's the old saying of a con game, but a confidence game of gaining people's confidence. So you set up a fake newspaper or a almost fake newspaper that runs stories. It looks like news, and that's part of what it's done. And it's it's not a new thing. It used to be done all the time. The idea of setting up the third party astroturf groups, but it's become much more affordable. Like the thing about it, and that companies like Facebook have absolutely worked hand in glove with companies like Cambridge Analytica to work to say, well, how are we going to suppress the vote in this area? How are we going to? They will actually help them target that information. The thing about it is, if you actually educate people and they become more aware they're being manipulated, that helps. People don't like to admit that they were manipulated by or fooled. Like it's embarrassing because they've been conned. But just to say again, it's why I think the work that you're doing is really important, because people need to understand the amount of money and effort that is actually going into manipulating people, and in ways that undermines people's ability to make sound decisions. And actually, it ends up being dangerous because people end up getting hurt. Like it has been shocking in the last 6 months to watch. For me, the most upsetting thing is just seeing people justifying people being killed or justifying people dying. It's the pandemic is hard for all sorts of people for their mental health, but to see, you can see a video, and this stuff did not ever used to happen, right? I can watch a video of somebody being murdered, and then I can go to Facebook and I'll see people on my timeline defending that person killing somebody and not saying they should go to jail. And that to me is atrocious. Like, this is a complete break in our sense of what's right and wrong. And that's part of what's super scary, is that people become immune or inured to what's happening, and they're actually justifying terrible things. And that's where I get really worried about things going in a bad, continuing to go in that direction. So part of it is the government has to do lots to make people safe, to make people economically secure, so that they're able to put food on the table. It's a colossal task, but I've told lots of people every single tool we need to make this happen exists. There's nothing we need to reinvent in terms of economics or getting people safe. The hard part is that is actually getting people to pull those levers, because we've been told for a long time, no, that won't work. Or people are sort of saying, oh, we're going to worry about the deficit. We're going to have a lot more things to worry about than the deficit if we don't make sure that people are able to look after themselves.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a big piece
Kaden, Dougald, going into this 2020 era, where do you think that AI and the ability to create fake images of people and what they say, where does that have that implementation on politics and our society going forward, especially with our pandemic, with the ability to fake information and what public officials can say? in real time.
It's the thing about it is that all those. It's funny. I've been watching. Is these things. I'm old, so I'm 51, but I keep seeing. I've seen every iteration of new AI or some new technology that looks freaky, and it looks super realistic at first, and then you start to realize something wrong is actually wrong. Right? I mean, human beings are actually incredibly good at detecting things that are wrong with people's faces, which is usually one of the big challenges. I mean, ultimately, we have to have. There's two things we have to have oversight, and this is the problem: is that both technology and technology and politics, especially in the U.S., people have been incredibly resistant to any kind of oversight, or regulation. But ultimately, these two things are only going to work if we have an effective law enforcement system, right? And effective regulation to make sure that, if somebody does something wrong like this, they can be caught and they can be punished. Though, look, I talked about forgiveness before, but I also believe that, you've got to, one way or another, you have to. It doesn't mean ruling out punishment sometimes, or facing consequences for what they've done. But the hard part about it is precisely that for many years that cheating in politics has been treated as something that it's something because it's its own set of rules that people don't necessarily understand, and people break rules in elections in all sorts of different ways. That courts are reluctant to intervene in a way I think they should. People used to go to jail for doing certain things, but courts have become very reluctant to enforce election laws, which I think is too bad. So you have to have strong oversight to make that happen. And AI, the hard part of, I think, one is the accountability question. Like, if you actually, the thing I suggested, what we have in politics is that every single candidate has what's called an official agent. And if they break the rules for spending, that is the person who's responsible. And you can actually go to jail for 5 years for spending in Canada for spending too much on a campaign. So what my idea was to say you'd have the same thing essentially for the internet, or for people who want to publish on Facebook. You just have to say, this is the person who's responsible for printing this stuff. They're an actual real person with an address. And if it turns out that they're publishing lies about somebody, or that they actually will be the ones who get into trouble. And that's part of it. It is literally what we have. The crisis is a crisis of accountability. And I think that's a huge thing. I've been talking about that for a while. But for people, like, whether you're Black Lives Matter, or whether you're people who are frustrated with elites not being jailed for their crimes, the issue with accountability is precisely that our justice system isn't working either, right? So, like, this is where things are starting to break down. So you have to have a return to accountability. You actually have to have a return to some sort of law, and have reasonable regulations where people understand that they'll face consequences if they break the rules. Like, sometimes they may be forced to apologize and make amends, and sometimes they'll be punished. But that without that, when there are no rules, there is no game, and we're getting to that point where there are no rules. So, or that internet companies would rather have no rules, right?
Absolutely, I agree. Like, there has to be some sort of consequence for publishing something that is so detrimental to the health of society.
Yeah.
And it's a really good idea, because I never really, kind of when I think about this, I look through everything through my perspective with polarization. I think to myself that there's really no way we can get out of it. But when you bring up the fact of treating companies like publishers, right? That seems like a really reasonable policy. And are you aware of any, like, state government, federal government, or provincial government trying to make legislation or putting legislation in place to make that happen? Because that would seem to me to be the most effective way to truly combat this, and also kind of bring society back to being more cohesive.
Yeah.
And less divided.
We've been pushing for that. We were trying to come up with a bill. The hard part about it is finding the Canadian definition for publisher. I know in Australia they're trying to do stuff where they're just trying to make people pay, and there's discussions in the federal Liberal throne speech. There were discussions about taxing them, but ultimately it is a question of legal accountability. And that's part of what they're trying to resist, right? So when they, if you even say to Facebook or Google, you have to pay people for their content, they'll say, well, that's a tax. It's like, no, it's not a tax. It's actually we're actually making you pay people for the stuff you're taking and making money from. And the business model of YouTube, Facebook, and Google has not just been surveillance and spying on people and collecting all their information. It's also taking intellectual property and not paying for it. So those are pretty questionable, pillars to build a business on. But ultimately, if they should be able to make, I believe they should still be able to make money and pay people. But one of the things is that they would actually might have to charge more for their advertising if they're going to pay people for the stuff they're taking, which would again help level the playing field with other outlets. Though but I think I've proposed that to the federal government. We'll suggest it again. But the idea of just treating these companies like publishers would be one of the biggest things it's one of the simplest things you can do. And because it addresses the crisis and accountability. And ultimately that is the heart of what's going wrong with all sorts of is that people are not being held to account one way or another, and like both in the justice system, politically, and all sorts of other ways. So you need to have a legal framework for it, but it would be simple to do in the States. Like if you just said if they just changed the Millennium Copyright Act. The hard part is they have so much money, they have enormous lobbying power, but ultimately the stuff they've done is so reprehensible that they really have to be. It's not even a question of reining them in. It's just saying, can you please follow the law, or could we please have some laws for internet companies to follow?
So far, you've been talking about accountability applied onto like companies and governments. But how about accountability applied onto like the people themselves? And so what I mean by that, I'm sure you heard about the recent new order that the commander of the Canadian Army, Lieutenant General Wayne Eyre, made about that outlines his intent to root out extremism from the ranks of the Canadian Armed Forces. Basically, it essentially relies on each member, like from the lowest rank private to the highest general, to actively be looking for people who potentially have these ideologies, extremist ideologies, and to call it out, to bring it up to their COC, the chain of command, or whoever, the military police, and then from there, higher ups will undergo proper procedures to investigate these individuals and etc. But again, fundamentally, it's the responsibility, the accountability is applied onto the people themselves to again, find these people. A quick look online, on like online forums about army nets and whatnot, shows that there's a mixed feeling on these orders. Like some people think that it's just like an unfruitful policy that just made so that that like higher ups can be seen that they're doing something. While others actually think that this is towards the right step, and I think this is something towards the right step. But how do you think? Do you think a similar policy could be made for Manitoba, for Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is the hard part again is that in terms of politics is that there's benefits to all sides, right? When you're division, the sad fact is division can work, but it's a short-term goal, or you get short-term gains and long-term it's terrible in the long term, right? There's a massive price to pay. And what you have to do is, I think of it as I may have talked about you about this before, but it's the idea of you have to change the way that you operate. And part of that is moving to a situation where people feel comfortable speaking up about something that's gone wrong. And that they won't. And so part of that is to say you're not necessarily going to face super harsh punishment. You have to create a culture where people are expected to speak up, and that they'll be protected if they speak up, because that's the opposite of what happens all the time. Instead, you get whistleblowers and people are punished all the time very harshly for doing the right thing, right? So you have to change the way you work in order to have a system where people are rewarded for doing the right thing, which means things like stronger whistleblower laws. Manitoba has some of the worst whistleblower laws in Canada, and Canada has some of the worst whistleblower laws in the world. So to be able to protect people, whether they're in public life or in private life, to be able to step up and do the right thing is critical, because right now you have a situation where it's far too easy to retaliate against whistleblowers and make their lives miserable, and that shouldn't happen, because it means that you have to move to a situation where it's not just letting people speak for the sake of whistleblowing, but so that you can achieve the change you want, right? So that you're actually moving to a new culture, and it's not easy, right? Because I've read that it actually takes essentially a political revolution in thinking, because it's a completely different way of acting. Because right now it happens all the time in government, right? That there's an urge, well, if you have this bad thing that happened, you better keep it quiet, right? And if you let it be known, or if it gets out, that there's always a political price to pay. So it's walking that line between actually rooting out the kind of, I call it corruption. It's corruption, whether it's petty or not. It takes a massive effort, but among the police and with the military, it's absolutely critical, because you have to be able to rely on those people to keep you alive and to keep you safe. So the level of trust that's essential in especially in the military and in police is critical. Although I'll say the one other thing is that's the thing that the pandemic has shown us, is the degree to which we all depend on each other. So the degree to which, like financially as well as in terms of public health, that getting people to behave and be nice to each other, and be able to report things and fix things before they blow up is critical. The hard part is that lots of people want to wait till the boat hits the iceberg and then start bailing instead of moving.
Sorry, just to stop you right here. We don't actually have a huge amount of time just because of bandwidth reasons. Okay. But I wanted to quickly ask a question, just you can touch on it a bit quickly. I think it's on everyone's mind, kind of the elephant in the room, I guess, so to speak, politically, about Kelvin Gertson. And his recent controversy. We don't want to get too political, but I think it kind of just relates to our theme about remaining accountable, especially our politicians, to whatever ties, maybe extremist ties, that they may have to organizations, and kind of the vetting process that needs to be done, and maybe, I guess, the dangers of not vetting who you're meeting up with, because this stuff, there's a lot of people with ties that we don't know about that aren't immediately clear, that need to be vetted. So,
well, I mean, this is something we noticed back in April or May when Gertson was originally meeting with these people who are really some of the most extreme politicians in the world, from Germany, Russia, Brazil. You'd be hard pressed to find a more extreme group if you tried. And the idea that, well, they were just talking about homeschooling, they have a much bigger agenda, and they've got lots of money, that they really are opposed to public schools in general, as well as to various kinds of human rights, especially around LGBTQ. But the hard part about this is that it's the same thing as within the States, is that there are all sorts of things people thought were rules and that had laws, but they're just norms. They're just conventions. So it used to be a thing that if a minister was spending time with politicians with views that extreme, it would be considered completely unacceptable, and they would be removed from cabinet, or forced, or at least they would admit they did something wrong and apologize and pay a price for it, right? And that's not happening. And to me, it's partly, I find it depressing, but it's also because there is a constituency for that kind of extreme thinking in Manitoba and in Canada. And the fact is, to me, it's the fact that governments are willing to tolerate this stuff and not call it out. I'm glad the media picked up on it. It was surprisingly hard for the media to start paying attention to this. But again, the reason why I think your group is important is because you're talking about this stuff, because there's a degree of radicalization that exists that people aren't aware of. and it's not just fringe groups, that there's overlap between political organizations and these fringe groups because there's benefit, because they see it as a benefit, is that they're able to rouse up a base against an enemy they perceive, whether it's immigrants, whether it's First Nations or Indigenous people or LGBTQ. And it's like I tend to blame the people who are in charge in making these decisions. Like, it's easy to I don't believe really much in going after followers, because I think it's terrible what's happening. I think people are being manipulated, and that it's really unfortunate that people are engaged in. There is widespread hate mongering in Canada and Manitoba happening right now, and it happens against politicians, which is terrible, and it happens against groups, which is terrible. And part of this is is turning it down and being able to say, it's actually not an acceptable way to act in politics if we're actually going to, because look, we're all one province, we're all one country, that these kind of divisions are dangerous because we're just hurting each other and punishing each other. And you cannot just keep escalating punishment. It doesn't work. There are ways out of this. Economically, it's a kind of forgiveness. I believe in debt forgiveness because it's debt that's driving this. And actual personal forgiveness, though it's a bit more spiritual, is also the sort of thing. When you talk about reconciliation, it needs to be real and economic, but we also need to be able to look at each other as human beings, and that it isn't easy. Right? But I mean, part of it is that what I'd like to do is avoid huge crises and not have street fights. But the hard part is that there are people who want that because they think that there's this sort of idea that one of the ideas that's baked into the idea of this of fighting and is that there are a bunch of bad people, and if we just get rid of them, everything will be good. Well, they're not going to go away, right? Is that they're actually still going to be there unless they're all eradicated, and that's not going to happen. I don't want that to happen. So we have to find a way to live together, and not just punish each other or escalate in this way. And some of it is just there's a fantastic guy he's a blues player who's helped get more than 50 people out of the Klan, and he does it by just dealing with them and on one-on-one. It's incredible what he's done. But that's the hard part, because on both sides of a polarization, people don't want to look at the others as human beings, because they're so offensive and annoying. Like, I'm not going to pretend that people who are on the other side of something they'll say truly terrible things.
Uh-oh.
Dougal was lost.
Well, unfortunately, we may have to potentially edit that out. But I think that was a very, very good conversation, and we were very thankful that Dougald was able to make it. Unfortunately, this is part of the issue that happens when you run, webinars and you're not in person. And also, I think it's a little hard to interject or ask questions, because you might have people talking over each other in this kind of format. But regardless, I think that went extremely well. And again, I really want to thank Dougald for providing his perspective, because he's just such a reasonable man, and he comes at this truly in good faith. Like, I think his aspect of what he was talking about, how we need to push, how people need to come together. And it's a good way to end it too, by talking about that blues player who talks to members of the KKK and is able to
Daryl Davis, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because if someone like that, who has a legitimate reason to find true disgust with those people based on their views of him just as a person, and he can sit down and he can have a conversation with them, and he can become friends with them, and he can kind of help them leave this sort of like environment, then really what's stopping us from talking to someone who has a different opinion than us, right? So I think that's a really good place to sort of start from, where we need to have these kind of conversations with everybody, because we need to overcome this, because this is just not a reasonable way for society to go, it's tearing us apart. So I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say, thank you for everyone taking the time, especially Dougald. Like, it was great to talk to him. He has so many interesting ideas. This is just like our kind of, I guess, our welcome back podcast. But we're going to be having a lot more of them, and we're not going to be just meeting from like certain political parties. We want to hear everyone's perspective from all different walks of life. So we've got really exciting stuff in the bag right now. So just stay tuned and watch it. And whoever's watching it, we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone who's listening. I think that's a good place to end it, guys, end the recording.
Okay. Sweet. Okay. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks.
Bye.